All right, I'll call this meeting to order. This is a special meeting of the Region 15 Board of Education, Monday, April 20th, 2020. Can we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. Before we begin our meeting, we're going to start with the mission statement of Region 15. The mission of Region 15, a collaborative community committed to excellence, is to educate every student to be productive, ethical, and engaged in a global society through proven and innovative learning experiences supported by its strong community whose decision-making is based on the best interests of all students. Before we begin our meeting, I wanted to provide an update of what brought us to this point tonight in doing our Board of Ed vote tonight. As you know, our budget presentation started on February 24th, which seems like a really long time ago. At that time, Mr. Smith presented a budget increase of 3.59%. On March 4th, we had a budget workshop on that number. Same thing on March 23rd. That was our first live streamed meeting. And on March 25th, we had a public hearing and another budget workshop. At that hearing was when we first discussed in public about how the governor issued an executive order that required regional boards of education to do a vote on our budget and not do a referendum. On April 6th, we were supposed to adopt our budget that day according to our original schedule, but instead of doing that, we had another workshop. And at that workshop, Mr. Smith presented a budget, an amended budget recommendation of 2.96%. With offsets to the budget recommendation that he had. At that meeting, there was a majority of the Board of Ed that was supporting the superintendent's recommended 2.96 budget. And at that meeting, the Board of Finance Chair of Middlebury, Bill Stoll, asked us if we could hold off our vote until May. And we had not heard at that time from Southbury. And the Board of Ed on the April 6th meeting had tentatively thought that we might do our vote in late April or May, early May. After that April 6th meeting, I called both First Selectmen from Southbury and Middlebury. And I learned from First Selectman Jeff Manville that Southbury town officials would prefer that the Board of Ed vote sooner rather than later on our school budget. Of course, this conflicted with what Middlebury said at the April 6th meeting. So I had a conversation with both First Selectmen and the Board of Finance chairs from both towns to discuss how we can best support the towns in setting their mill rate for the budget process, as well as certain operational issues that they had. Both First Selectman Jeff Manville and Board of Finance Chair John Michaels asked if we could do our budget vote as soon as possible so that they can set their mill rate. And First Selectman Ed St. John and Board of Finance Chair Bill Stowell both said that that was fine and they were amenable to that. Mr. Smith felt that we were good to go today with our budget and his budget presentation. So we are here tonight, hopefully to vote on our budget. I would like to publicly thank First Selectman Jeff Manville and First Selectman Ed St. John, as well as the both chairs of the Board of Finance of both towns for all of their input into our budget process. I really appreciate the collaboration that occurred last week. And so we are hopefully here tonight to vote on our budget after Mr. Smith makes another amended presentation. Just to go over some main rules for our meeting. Make sure you are on mute unless you are speaking. Any board members, if you want to speak, please raise your hand and I will try my best to call out your name in the order which you raised your hand. And please remember to state your name before you speak. All right, so moving on to presentations, the adjusted proposed 2020-21 budget reflecting implications of the pandemic. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Ms. Manzo. As the world we live in changes momentarily, when we left last time, we had talked about the current state of affairs and then promised an update tonight. Since that time, we've heard from board members and community members strongly about some of the items in the budget and some requests. So what I'm going to walk you through tonight, let me share my screen here. So you should be able to see the PowerPoint. So this is where we left things. This was the February 24th presentation that had the 3.59% increase. Then on April 6th, we came back and we talked about a early payout of the early retirement incentive. This is the 5th payment in a 5-year plan. This is in next year's budget. So just to, and I'll talk about this a lot tonight, but in order for us to reduce or alter next year's budget, we have to take some things out, purchase them with savings from this year in order to change or alter what's in next year. When we built the 3.5% budget, almost all of that budget was staff contractual salary increases and health insurance. There weren't a lot of new programs in next year's budget to begin with. And so the challenge we have now is, in order to alter next year's budget and either reduce it or add things to it, we have to be able to pull some things out. And we do not want to pull things out that would create a long-term impact. And those are recurring costs. So on April 6th, we had two pieces that we could pull out of next year's budget: the early retirement payment and the purchase of the new financial software. That was a total of $450,000, and that brought our 3.5% budget down to a 2.96. The concerns that have that were talked about that evening and since would be the concern over class sizes in the primary grades, specifically at LMES, MES, and GES. The concern that especially primary students are being impacted by this prolonged school closure or remote learning. That because younger students have less of a background knowledge, that their gaps are going to be disproportionate. And it's unclear what will happen once school returns, whether or not there will be another prolonged remote learning session, when we can open, what other costs may be incurred. I can hear an echo. I don't know if someone has their mic not muted, but if you don't, please do so. So some amendments that we'll talk about tonight based on those concerns would be to increase the number of staff at the primary grades by 3 with 1 intervention teacher. One of the challenges we face is physical size of buildings. So at Long Meadow specifically, we have a higher than usual 2nd grade that we talked about adjusting for class size. The challenge there is we don't have a physical classroom space that we could split a classroom into. So what we're proposing is that we would hire an intervention teacher and allocate it directly to 2nd grade to do some of the same student-based intervention work and differentiation that the other schools, Middlebury Elementary and Gainfield, will gain by adding an additional teacher and reducing their class sizes. When we add 4 teachers and 3 sections to the school environment, one challenge we have is that it creates a need for a specials teacher. This would be, we believe, either an art or PE. It's a little premature in schedule crafting to identify which it would be, but we know that we would need one of the two. We believe it'll only be a half-time teacher, and we'll talk about how we're going to fund that as we go through. Right now, the expectation is some of the federal relief funds will be passed on to school districts through Title I. Right now, we don't know how much is going to come to Title I, but we do feel that at least a half-time teacher can be put into the Title I grant. So that won't show up in the budget. Based on the insurance renewal, if you remember, the insurance renewal that we budgeted was 10%. That was much higher than we've seen in the last 3 years, and we were concerned that it was an outlier. That number has been adjusted downward by about 4.5%. However, I think that all parties involved have a lot of skepticism as to the metrics that are being used, in that none of them take into account what a pandemic could do to our future projections. So we feel that it's conservative to take 1%, and instead of budgeting it, we were really 9.5%. There was a 0.5%, if you remember from my earlier presentation, in other types of insurance that took the 10% health insurance and brought it down to 9.5%. But instead of budgeting at 10 for the health insurance, we would budget at 9. And I'll show you how that impacts our budget number in a minute. But we feel that we can use that conservative estimate of insurance projections to offset some of the cost. So here's kind of the budgetary impacts and the cost offset. So in order for us to add the 4 teachers into next year's budget, we basically have to remove the equivalent cost of those teachers from the budget. We're not cutting these items. We're simply purchasing them with savings in this year because of the prolonged school closure and taking them out of next year's budget. None of these items are reoccurring costs, so that when we go to build the 21-22 budget, we do not have to build any of these costs back in. So you'll see that as we go through, the curriculum audit would come, we would purchase that now, and we would get started sooner, but we wouldn't have to pay for it out of next year's budget. The same is true with everything you see on this list. Technology is a little different in that that was one of the areas that went up. We had approximately $84,000 in increased technology costs in next year's budget. So while we pulled $61,000 out, it still allows us a small increase that we feel over time you still need to strengthen our technology budget. But we would then pre-purchase some of the technology equipment that's in next year's budget. The other piece that we are concerned about are the 1,000 Chromebooks that we passed out to students during this prolonged emergency remote learning experience. And so that technology, what we're proposing is that we would lease Chromebooks and other technology using that money, so that approximately $50,000 of that technology money would be turned into a lease and allow us approximately $150,000 in purchasing power. And the offsets that we pull out of next year's budget total the $260,000, which is the approximate cost of 4 teachers. The main purpose of that would be to adjust the class sizes at the elementary school. You'll see the 4 classes that would be impacted by those teachers. And while the Long Meadow grade 2 stays high, the support comes in the manner of an interventionist. So it doesn't change the class size, but it does mean that there's an extra teacher charged with servicing those 86 students. And then you'll see the kindergarten, first grade, and second grade adjustments based on the additional teacher. And so as we go through, these adjustments don't reduce any programs in next year. It maintains every single improvement that we had budgeted for in the original February proposal. It avoids any type of compounded long-term effect. We're not purchasing anything reoccurring out of next year's budget that will then be exaggerated in the following year. It continues to replace all of the technology in the district. It does provide some flexibility. Again, we're not sure what's going to happen in June, July, August, October, and we feel we do need some flexibility in next year's budget. So this doesn't take a ton of risk or is overly aggressive in our cost estimates for next year. It does provide some additional tools, whether it be the interventionist or the added technology. It doesn't pass on any of the additional services to taxpayers. Not one of those teachers that we add is added to the budget in a way that impacts the taxpayer. And if anything, we used the savings from this year to offset next year's proposed increase by about 0.5% and bring it under 3%. So we are acknowledging the financial impact to the communities. We did not raise any student fees. This still doesn't change although slight, it's still a reduction in student parking fees that we heard from. It does not increase pay to play or any other student cost. It does apply the savings that we have from transportation and other areas to reduce the burden to both towns. And I do think we've heard both the concerns of the constituents that have written in, as well as the board members. This is the same slide from April 6th as far as the impact to the two towns. Again, it is unchanged. So based on the savings and the work that we did on the back end, you're adding 4 teachers and additional technology without increasing the reduction that we proposed a few weeks ago. And with that, I will pause my screen sharing and can take any questions.
Any questions from, oh, I see Heather Dwyer has a question.
Hi, this is Heather Dwyer. Thank you for this. I just want to ask, could you just walk through a little bit where the $260,000 offset is coming from?
Sure. So I'm going to try to go back to screen sharing. Okay, so these are items in next year's budget. I'm turning my head, you can see this now, yep. That are in next year's budget that we will be purchasing with savings in this year's budget, and they will be removed from next year's budget. And then we will not have to purchase them again. They're one-time costs. So the curriculum audit is in next year. So what you'll see on the left hand here, this is the item. And on the right-hand side is the dollar amount that's in next year's budget for this item. So these are the first, the initial purchase of textbooks, the curriculum audit. These are the risers for the choral program at Memorial, the wrestling mats for the high school. This is the upgrade of the library software. So there are 2 components to the library software. One part is a renewable cost, and one is a one-time. This is the one-time portion of the library software. Every 3 years, we have to do a mandated asbestos review. So technically, you will see this again, but not for 3 years. This is the 1% reduction in healthcare. We budgeted at 10%. This will reduce that to a 9%. Both are, this is extremely conservative, both from Anthem's actuarial projections and our insurance consultant that works with both the 3 towns in our consortium on insurance projections. And then this would be the technology. Again, the technology budget was going to increase at approximately $84,000. So there's still a slight increase in the technology budget, but this would then basically purchase the items this year. Although what we're proposing is to turn this, instead of making this a one-time flat out purchase, that we would do a dollar lease, which would basically mean we would make payments over time for approximately, again, there's a lot of ways to structure this, but approximately 3 times the amount of the lease in year 1. And then we'd have payments to make for the next 3 years. when I'm in this mode, I can't see you. So I don't know if that answers your questions.
All right, it's Heather Dwyer. I guess, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought at the April 6th meeting, we talked about realizing a total saving from the school closure of about $475,000. And most of that was eaten up by prepaying the retirement incentive as well as the financial software. So is it because we have now extended school closure through May 20th that these are additional savings that we're realizing and we're able to prepay these items, or that's
Yes.
what I'm trying to understand.
So yes, so basically nothing has changed from the April 4th presentation. The bus savings that we show, and I took that slide out of here, but the total that you saw, the breakdown of transportation, that was prior to some of the work that's happened since then and the extended closing till May 20th. So this 260,000 is an additional amount of savings on top of the 450. I'm trying to read that slide, but the approximately 450,000. So if you see the slide now, this is what we showed on April 5th. I have the YouTube stream to my left, so that's why I keep looking that way. The approximately 450,000 that we showed on April 6th, that stays, nothing's changed on that. This would be an additional 260,000 in cost offsets or savings that we have this year. We know, for example, that we're not going to fire up boilers between now and May 30th. So there's heating savings, there's electricity savings, there's transportation savings, there's overtime savings. So those are the main categories that go to fund that 260,000.
And I know you can't see me, so I'm just going to plow ahead. This is Heather Dwyer. And just the other question I wanted to ask about this is, if school were to open sometime between May 20th and June 12th, does this budget that you're proposing allow for us to do that, or are we assuming that there is no school for till the end of the year? I mean, if we adopt this budget, do we have the flexibility to open school if we need to?
We do. So when we settled our bus contract, the bus contract does have a carve out for the possibility of school opening. So we're sure 100% that our bus savings that we've locked into this is absolute and complete. Whether school opens or not, that contract is settled. There are funds in here should we need to open school, as far as electricity or other costs that could be at graduation, end of year activities. All of those costs have not been removed from this budget. So should that happen, we would then talk about other things that we would do or hold on to that because of potential or increased summer school attendance, student services, those kinds of things. But this does not make the assumption or absorb the costs that would be needed for in case school did open.
Heather Dwyer, before you get your next question, I see your hand raised again. Josh, is there any way that you could mute John Cookson's telephone call? Because I'm catching feedback from his telephone, but now he's on video.
Yes.
And he says, yeah, thank you. He says he's disconnected on his end. He just needs you to disconnect on your end. All right, Heather Dwyer, you're up again.
All right, one other question that I wanted to ask, which hasn't really been a big part of the budget discussions up to this point, is about special education contingency. And I wonder what we have in that planned for next year, and what kind of flexibility we have going into next year?
So when we built the budget, let's stop sharing. So when we built the budget, we built in about 150,000, not about, exactly 150,000 in special ed contingency costs. While that's a little less than we have in the past, I think this year we were much more specific and accurate about the costs that we had this year. So going into next year, I know that we've built the total cost of what we needed. And so we're more confident in the actuals going into this year, which is why we built in, I think this current year's budget, I want to say there was 200 in there. But I think that, and Joe's checking that now, but that also didn't have the specific information that we had when we built this year's budget. And so we increased this year's budget for special education. The other thing we did this year is we built, or I say this year, in the proposed budget in front of you, we also built in money for the extended school year services over the summer, which historically have not been budgeted for in the district. And that's where some of that contingency was used for. So now that we're budgeting for summer school, contingency isn't necessarily needed to pay for summer school and can be used for actual contingency of unexpected student cost.
So that 150K is a real buffer, as opposed to in the past where it was not necessarily all buffer.
Right. In the past, it had to go to offset summer school. This year, while it may need a little bit to offset summer school, it doesn't have to cover the whole cost of summer school. So that's where we feel that we're probably going to increase summer school slightly over the next couple of years to make sure that we're budgeting for actuals. And it was too high to do it in 1 year, but we're closer to actuals and we don't need that contingency to make up that cost.
All right. Up, I see Steve Sirianni, and then after that, it's Brian.
Steve Sirianni speaking. So Superintendent Smith, in your last answer there, I got a little lost, I think, in the terminology, and I don't know, I'm asking you to address, you might have just done this, but the, I'm going to use the word compensatory. I know that's not necessarily the word maybe everyone's using, but the compensatory special education costs that we might be having to deal with, is that address, like, would that be addressed with summer school or anything you just recently mentioned?
So if you control for this year, in a normal school year, the ESY or extended school year program is part of the compensatory services provided to students during summer months. Historically, we haven't really budgeted for that, and that money came out of the contingency fund. The question I think you're asking is how will that be different this year? And I think it's too early to know that specifically, in that how you define compensatory education in a global pandemic. Currently, the federal and state guidelines do not consider any impact of the pandemic or remote educational learning to factor into what has traditionally been considered compensatory, because any gap that a student is receiving is proportionate to the gap that all students are receiving, where normally compensatory services is built based on a gap that's not kind of ubiquitous or shared among all the other students. And I'll look to Dr. Toretto that if I need qualifying or depth, please feel free to join in at any point.
Josh, also just to clarify, last year's budget was $230,000 for contingency.
But Joe, while you're on, but we budgeted 0 for ESY
Yeah, ESY, we budgeted 0. Now we boosted that line by $100,000.
So to clarify, ESY is extended school year, and that's for students who require extra education services so that they don't fall back beyond where they can recoup in the following fall. That's separate than what's happening now. So we really don't know how we're going to tackle the issues for all students that are having some kind of a slide due to COVID-19, and won't know what we can do until we can forecast when we'll be back at school. So those are two different pieces. So there's students who would get extended school year services regardless of what's happening with COVID-19, because we've been tracking data year long to know who requires it. So that's why they're separate.
All right, Brian Watson, you had a question?
Yeah, Brian Watson. I have two questions. One has to do with the technology. The lease that purchasing the lease, how does that align with the district's plan for replacement of technology over the next few years and that kind of cycle?
So originally when we built the budget, we had talked about a lease, but at a 3.5%, we didn't build in any additional costs for that. Our budget as presented in February accounted for the replacement cycle of everything in the 2021 school year as planned as part of the annual replacement cycle. Since then, though, two things have happened. One of them being we handed out 1,000 Chromebooks. That may or may not come back. Some of those were machines that were slotted for replacement anyway, and some of them weren't. And then the other thing is by leveraging some of the money out of next year, the concern isn't so much the 2021 replacement cycle, it's the 21-22 replacement cycle. And there's a bubble that kind of comes through. Part of that's because historically the district has not had an annual replacement fund equal to the amount of machines that need to be replaced. And so some years you replace more and some years you replace less, but you get into like an ebb and flow or a peak and valley of a replacement cycle. And so by purchasing more machines next year that we had originally planned to do, it starts to kind of flatten the curve for the 2020 or 21-22 school year.
And then my next question is, I know what you talked about in like the first budget presentation, but can you just talk about how this budget with the new numbers and everything will address some of the social emotional needs that might have arisen because of the pandemic and, that you might have to be dealing with next year?
So I don't know that there's any new dollars put into it based on these last two nights specific to social emotional needs. I think the things that would happen is, one, you could say that by having the smaller K2 classrooms, the teachers can more individualize and adjust to individual students. Students will get more attention because the ratio of student to teacher will be greater. However, I think the bigger shift is more kind of what's happening that's budget neutral, and that is the review of guidance curriculum of social workers, but there's no additional resources specific to social emotional needs of students. I think that you could also make the argument that by budgeting somewhat conservatively, that if we get back to school and there is an increased need, that we have some flexibility in kind of how we budgeted, where we could adjust and bring in more resources. It's really hard for us to predict what that's going to be right now, just because there's really, we're talking to students and parents, but a lot of that's through email or short conversations. We don't really know the impact long term of what kind of this environment is doing to students.
Any other questions by Board of Ed members? Sharon Attic, and then Peter, and then Richard.
Hi, this is Sharon Attic. Thank you so much for your presentation. I know you've been working extremely diligently, so thank you for that. The offsets that you presented, are those based on school being out for the remainder of the year? Just want to make sure I understand that.
The short answer is no.
Okay, so in follow-up to that then, if school is out for the remainder of the year, there would be likely additional offsets. What actually happens to those offsets? Does that go back to the town? Does it become like a flexible account that we can include those funds into 2021? Where I'm going with this is clearly you've included in your presentation, you had a bullet in there for additional things to support, I think, this integration back to school, not knowing what potential additional health crises could even happen next year. So I just want to make sure that this budget actually has enough flexibility to be able to manage any potential changes, recurrence of the virus, potential additional school closures, things that we may see as a downstream of what we're living through now, but actually hit in 2021.
So the hardest part of that question is the downstream question and what resources would be needed. I think some of that is even for this year, nobody knew what, and even on a day-to-day kind of to Mr. Watson's question, we don't even know right now some of the resources that may be kind of being created. So how much do you need for what we don't know is a really hard question. That being said, so for example, and like an easy one is, there's probably $18,000 in electricity that if school doesn't open and we don't have to put air conditioning on at the high school, there's real electrical savings. So in June, or maybe a little, maybe earlier than that, on May 20th or something, if we know that school is going to be closed for the remainder of the year, we would have a conversation as to what happens to that 18,000. There's a couple of things that could happen. We could add it to, let's say, buying down that technology curve and flattening it out. We could, the non-recurring capital fund is kind of the place where we as a school district could take that and say, gee, right now our non-recurring capital fund is very small. Now I'm looking at Joe a little bit. I think there's $150,000 in there. That is not a very, is it 200? But there's not a lot of money from a major capital project standpoint. And so we could use that 18, what's that, Joe? Sorry.
I'll get you a number. That was about 275.
So that non-recurring capital fund, if a boiler breaks or if we need to put a roof on or something large, that 275 isn't enough to actually do the project. So we could put the money in there. And oftentimes the conversation with the towns is if we had 18,000 and we could decide to give that back to the town. But if a boiler breaks and we need to bond that, the bond payment then gets put into our budget that the towns pay for on the other side. And now you're paying for something over 20 years that you could have paid for in 1 year. And so, but that's a conversation that we would have with the board. It would probably start at the finance committee and then go to the full board based on what those savings, and a conversation on 18,000. If it ended up being 150,000, that might be a different conversation than a conversation around 18,000. But that's kind of, all of that happens really as we get close to the end of the school year. Like last summer, we used that money to put a roof on Gainfield. And so a lot of times that remainder at the end of the year goes into doing projects that have either kind of gone past their useful life and been delayed because we couldn't afford them. Or something like the high school locker rooms or something like that, but some kind of capital project.
180,000, Josh.
Thank you.
So this is Sharon Attic. I just want to make sure I'm understanding and maybe ask a follow-up question. So if there are additional offsets that are observed, because let's say we don't go back to school, it sounds like there's going to be conversations that happen with the finance committee, potentially with the town. But the examples that I heard were based off of potential capital investments or infrastructural investments. And I want to make sure that not lost in that conversation would be any way any of those offsets could even.
No, so the hard part, I guess the easy part of that is if there are needs for the extended school year program and we had to provide more services over the summer, that those funds, the way the auditors see it is that the summer school is an extension of this school year. So even though it happens beyond July 1, that program's part of this school year. So we could extend some of those funds to provide enhanced services over the summer, or one-time non-recurring purchases. So the challenge with your question is depends on the resource you're talking about, but you wouldn't want to purchase a recurring. So let's say we had $70,000 at the end of the year. We wouldn't bring in a social worker because that now creates a reoccurring cost in the budget. And so, well, I guess technically we could, but the board would have to acknowledge that because when we build next year's budget, we've now basically added the cost to next year's, the 21-22 budget, if it's a recurring cost that we purchase with kind of those funds at the end of the year, which is why most times they go to a non-recurring type purchase.
Okay, so to your point, though even those areas, let's say just going back to technology, where you saw some of that money could go back and maybe buy more Chromebooks or something of that nature. Okay, that helps. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate your patience with my follow-up questions.
It's okay. The challenge about what we want to do here is not create a situation where 2 years from now or 3 years from now, we've created a disproportionate increase. So if I buy something out of next year's budget that recurs, let's say, even if it's an $8,000 cost, the following year, now the budget goes up that $8,000 plus whatever inflationary costs go into that. So you kind of compound the impact in next year if you don't use any funds to buy down non-recurring costs.
Thank you.
All right, Peter Vaccarelli, you had a question?
Peter Vaccarelli, Marion and Josh, can you explain how we went from 2.5 teachers to 4 or 4.5?
I can. So if you
overall, how many total teachers are we putting on?
So there's 4 teachers going into the operating budget and a half a teacher in a Title I grant.
Okay, and those are reoccurring expenses, correct?
So yes.
Okay. I'm trying to understand how we made this quantum leap in 2 weeks.
So the conversation, as I understood it on April 6th, was that there was a concern of class sizes of 21 or more at the kindergarten through 2nd grade level. So in order to address the 4 classrooms that were projected at that size, you needed to bring in what ended up to be 3 classroom and 1 intervention teacher to address that concern. So by finding the offsets, so although they're reoccurring costs, the overall budget reduction happens. So there's an offset, both in next year's budget, and then they're kind of baked in to the overall budget, budget cost for next year.
One more thing, Josh, this FOI number. Can we go back to the 275,000 and figure out how we got to 180?
You have to help me out there. FOI?
Yeah, that's a single project you're doing. You can go in there once a year, correct? For special projects?
Are you talking capital, Peter?
Capital.
The non-recurring capital account.
Yeah.
So that, I'll have Joe pull up the number, but the way it's set up in the regional district is we can go in there kind of whenever we need to, as long as, and actually we don't currently have a policy. That's one of the policies that actually we just put into place. I have to help me. because before Joe and I, the district could kind of go in there as often as needed. Now we still can go in as often as we need, but we have to go through the board to get any project approved before any purchase can be made out of there.
Okay,
All right, Richard Spirito, you had a question?
No, I have a comment. Is that all right?
Sure.
My name is Richard Spirito, Board of Education member from Middlebury. My comments are basically, we are in an unbelievable worldwide health epidemic, not knowing where the end is. We know that the United States is going into a financial crisis when over 22 million people are unemployed, which is approximately 15% of the workforce. And the possibility of failure of many, many, many businesses. As a matter of fact, the largest business in Middlebury, Timex, is completely closed. IMF is forecasting a greater recession, or depression, I should say, than in 1929. When our audit costs are over $20,000 per student. So we are not shortchanging education. If we approve a budget, a status quo budget that is, it's one that was voted on by the voters of both towns. As you know, the governor has taken away the right to vote on budgets. I don't know if that's constitutional or not, but just a comment I have to make. We need to look at the big picture.
Richard, I don't know if you could hear me, but I can't hear you anymore.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little problem with my computer. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Okay.
But Richard, if I could just interrupt you for a second, we are going to be having later a discussion on the budget with the Board of Ed. I don't know if you want to save your comments for when we're having a Board of Ed discussion about the budget, or if it was more appropriate to have a question for Josh, or you wanted to say your piece now, or save it for when we're having a discussion.
I will save it for the rest of the discussion.
All right. I do want to hear what you have to say.
I'll save it.
Okay. Any other questions for Josh? Peter Vaccarelli.
Josh, is there a specific flexible budget? And if there is, how much money is in it?
So I think the short answer is no. There is no flexible budget. The only, we don't have like a general fund like the town does. Everything in our budget is in a line item and tied to an object. I would say the closest thing, if you want to talk about how we use the special ed contingency fund, but it's in the special ed budget, and it's based on reoccurring actuals as far as students or costs that materialize over the course of the year. The only other kind of flexible account we have would be that non-recurring capital account. But it's not something that Joe and I can just use to offset anything for any reason. It's got to have a purpose, and it's got to have a one-time cost, and it has to go through the board to be approved. There's no account that Joe or I can go to and just allocate for whatever reason.
The only other account, Peter, and they're small, is like our repair accounts or maintenance. In other words, there's costs against them, but in other words, that's typically every year boilers need service, all that kind of stuff. But to Josh's point, most of the stuff is supplies are budgeted based on need and use. I mean, they're pretty fairly prescriptive. I mean, not perfect, but fairly prescriptive. The capital account would need a board motion to do anything with that. So any money that comes out of capital would have to go for board action on a motion to take money out of the capital plan based on the new policy.
Okay.
Steve Sirianni had a question.
Steve Sirianni speaking. Josh, so in the last, not tonight, but the presentation prior, or even the first one, you had the class sizes, to sort of piggyback on Peter's question, you had the class sizes at a certain level with less teachers, and now you are, you're adding the 4. And I said at the time, if that's your recommendation, I would support that, which I will. But I'm wondering what has, changed, I guess, since then and now. Could you just maybe just speak a little more to that, please?
Sure. I think when we built the budget in February, we knew that those classes were slightly higher than kind of the comfort level and historical numbers in the district. However, at that time, we were coming to you with a 3.5% increase, and we're very much aware of the kind of impact of having one of the higher than usual budget increases. And at the time, couldn't justify putting extra teachers or additional teachers in the budget to bring those numbers down. And although we didn't love them, we didn't feel that they were too high. Since then, you've had a compromised school year. We've heard clearly from the community that they're not comfortable with that. And we do feel that the compromised school year will have long-term impact on everybody, but especially our youngest learners. I think in addition, we've been able to find the cost for those teachers with offsets and savings that we didn't anticipate this year. And even 2 weeks ago, we didn't know what the savings would be. If we were talking about adding 4 teachers on top of a 3.5% budget, I don't think I could sit here in good conscience and tell you that the budget increase and the staffing were justified. But I think the fact that we could reduce the budget by 0.5%, bring it down to within what would have been a more reasonable cost increase in any budget year, and provide the extra supports for students based on this compromised learning, I think that's why I feel comfortable with it. Joe and I worked pretty hard to go through and find ways to keep the budget proposal tonight at a 296. It would have been really easy for us to just bake in the 4 teachers and go back to a 3.5. But I think, to Mr. Spirito's and Mr. Vaccarelli's points, we recognize that there are long-term financial impacts that we want to be conscious of. And I think to the credit of our communities, and I know the number has been changed, but I think we heard from about 200 families who said, don't compromise. And I think to listen to those voices, and I understand that 200 may not be the same as 5,000, but they are 200 that were very vocal and took the time to reach out. So I don't think I can dismiss that either. And the fact that, again, we can do that and still reduce the budget I was comfortable with in February by 0.5% is something that I felt was warranted coming forward tonight, and to let you as a board make kind of the decision going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from Board of Ed members?
I have a question, Marion.
Yep, go ahead, Richard.
Uh,
Can you put your video on?
yes.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, there you go. Josh, so you're saying that if tax collections are down, you're going to adjust the budget accordingly?
Once the referendum or the board vote in this case has been passed, I cannot adjust the budget accordingly. What we can do, and what we've talked to the towns about, is to the best of our ability, we can adjust the payment cycle. So, for example, once the budget's passed, we put together basically a monthly billing statement for each town. At the end of the day, we're a fee for service, and we bill the towns on a monthly basis like an other service would. What we do have some flexibility to do is to alter the payment cycle so that if towns do experience a collection issue, that we can help them out in the month of July and stagger the payments. Part of the reason Southbury, my understanding that Southbury asked for the vote tonight, is so that they could help families recognize what the impact would be and adjust accordingly. And then how the town decides to pay those is somewhat up to them. But Joe and I will work with the finance directors and the first selectmen to adjust those payment cycles. That is within our control. But the actual bill or cost to the towns is not.
So what happens if the towns can't afford it? What if they only collect, say, 70% of their proposed budget?
Well, I mean, the technical answer is that they would have to either, there are some communities facing that situation right now, and they're going to short-term lending markets to make their payments. They don't have the option to not pay.
They don't have the option to not pay, right? Correct?
As uncomfortable of a conversation that is,
that is money either. So there is no answer then.
And again, this is an uncomfortable conversation, but yes, there are other towns in that position, and they do go to short-term lending markets to meet their bills. Both Southbury and Middlebury have, I want to say AAA, but one might have a AA bond rating, and that's where they would have to allocate some type or float some type of community bond to make their payments. It would be the same. Go ahead, Joe.
And the towns that are doing that right now, frankly, weren't in great shape to begin with going into this. I mean, I'm not, the two towns are in good shape. I mean, obviously I get it, it's tax collection. That's an issue, at least right now with that 90-day rule. But there was a couple articles floating around. A couple towns that are mentioned weren't really in great financial shape before the recession hit as well.
Correct, Joe. The town of Southbury has a very big undesignated balance, but not the town of Middlebury. It's not anywhere near what Southbury has, as you know. Also, that means if we can't collect the money, we have to borrow the money. So we not only do we have to borrow the money to pay the region, we have to pay the interest on the money to borrow it. And hopefully over the years that we borrow that, we'll be able to pay it back. Otherwise, the town will have to declare bankruptcy, correct?
Richard, I'd like to step in, if that's okay, Josh. This was definitely the subject of a conversation that we had with both first selectmen last week. And we did discuss the nervousness that the towns had about how they're going to collect taxes and what the expectations are, and people having income affected by the pandemic, versus escrows, it kept in for mortgage payments and all that kind of stuff. And I think that we settled that the finance directors of the towns and in Region 15 were going to work out and hopefully accommodate the town's cash flow situation as best as possible. And they kind of talked a little bit more detail than I think we need to get into at a Board of Ed meeting. But I think both towns felt that, from what I saw, I think both towns felt that we understood the concern and that we were willing to work with them as best as we can, and that, we're all facing this together. And I think that both towns felt assured that, we will work with them.
I hope you're right, Marion.
I hope I am too. Like I had a good feeling from the conversation that we had with the town officials last week. So I'm just trying to convey that because I understand your concern, Richard.
Thank you.
Yep. Peter, do you have a question? Or?
I do, Marion.
Okay.
I would like everybody to seriously think about getting an additional $10,000 tax bill from our towns. Now, some people in our towns can afford that. A great many of them are hanging by their teeth right now. They're not employed. They haven't collected any money yet. And they're in a real scrape. I think this budget needs to go back to zero. That's where this budget needs to go. We are going to leave a lot of residents hanging out on a limb for the sake of maintaining this upward movement. We could do away with that for 1 year completely. We don't need 4 more teachers. We agreed to 2.5. This is absolutely ridiculous. I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Are there any more questions for Josh on his proposed budget before we enter any discussions as a board and public comment? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Smith, for your presentation. I really appreciate it. I know how hard that you and Mr. Martino have been working. So thank you very much. We're going to move on to the next item on the agenda. Before board discussions, we're going to have public comment. I would like to say that we have received well over 200 emails about the budget since our last meeting on April 6th. And we are going to be adding those public comments to the minutes of this meeting. We're not going to read each one because we're going to be here a long time if we did. So as far as comments from citizens, the Board of Education will recognize citizens of Middlebury and Southbury, and the citizens are asked to state their name, their town of residence, and to limit their comments to 3 minutes. And please know that due to state law, the Board of Education does not directly respond to public comment, but we are listening and we do welcome comments. So if there's any public comment, Josh, I kind of turn it over to you to figure out who's up.
Thank you, Marion. We have a caller, as far as I can tell. We have a caller and a Mr. Bob Theriault. I'm going to unmute him now. I'm going to try to unmute him now.
I think that might be who Mr. Cookson is logged in as.
Oh, okay. In that case, we have caller 3. Caller 3, you're on with the Board of Education. Would you state your name and would you like to make a public comment?
Yes, my name is Maggie Smith and I'm a resident of Middlebury, Connecticut.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just hoping that you could justify your decision to increase the budget in light of the recent economic downturn due to COVID-19. At least one of you acknowledged that COVID-19 has had an impact on our communities and has left us in an uncertain position. So my question is, how can you be comfortable increasing the budget when hundreds of families in Middlebury and Southbury are struggling? What gives you the right to increase the income to the region when everyone else is being forced to cut costs and live with less? Additionally, in regards to the 4 new full-time teachers, you have said that, that you've made budget cuts to allow for their salaries this upcoming year. But how will you compensate them going forward? They're a recurring expense. So how will you allow for this in the coming years? How are these expenses, as you have said, baked in to future budgets?
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. As you may remember, I said that the Board of Ed does not respond to public comment, but we are listening. Thank you. Is there any more public comment?
I don't see anyone else, Josh.
There was one more that popped in, but has since left.
Yeah.
So I do not think there are any more public comments. We do have approximately 63 people streaming this on the web, but currently caller 5 has just arrived.
There we go.
Caller 5, you are on with the Board of Education at public comment. If you'd like to make a comment, please state your name and then make your comment.
Amy Rayevsky, Middlebury, Connecticut.
Go ahead, Ms. Rayevsky.
I am very impressed with the proposed budget for the 2021. I'm very impressed with the proposed budget for the 2021 school year. I appreciate the responsibility of purchasing items now to offset costs for the next year. I think the addition of the teachers is very smart and will be needed, as we know the kids will need extra support when we return to school. I'm asking all board members to support and approve the 2.96 proposed budget. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
As of now, there are no other call-ins.
Okay. I'll give it 5 more seconds in case anyone else wants to call in. All right, next item on the agenda is the board discussion and possible action to approve the 2020 to 2021 school budget. So I thought we can start having a motion on where there was general consensus from the Board of Ed and kind of start the conversation at that point. So could I have a motion to approve the 2021 school budget?
This is Heather Rogers. I move that the Board of Education approve the 2020-2021 budget increase of $72,909,774, which represents a 2.9% increase.
Just
Yep, 2.96%.
Yep, 2.96. That's right. Right. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Was that you, Brian? Yes.
Brian Watson will second.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Brian Watson, second. And now we'll open it up to discussion. So anyone has a comment, just raise their hand. Okay, Sharon Attic.
Hi, this is Sharon Attic. Marion, I wanted to ask a follow-up question based off of your earlier comments. When you met with the Board of Finance and the town selectmen, and understanding what the proposed budget was during that time, the 2.96, was there any conversations relative to the impact on the residents? I heard some comments earlier and some numbers thrown out, but I don't see how that 2.96 actually equates to the dollar amount that was spoken to earlier. So is any discussion over how this increase could or would impact people? You know, what's the percentage increase in their overall budget? I mean, from a fiscally dollar amount. I don't know if I'm being clear, but
no, I get your point. And I think that I'm going to have to ask Josh or Joe to help out with the second part of what you're asking. But I did hear from both first selectmen that they thought that the 359 was pretty was a tough pill to swallow, and I think they appreciated the movement to the 296. Ideally, I think both towns would love it if we could go lower, but I did also hear that they, particularly town officials from Southbury, wanted a true budget. They wanted to know what we were really facing. And there definitely was a concern about cash flow, which I feel that was addressed. But in terms of the potential impact to Southbury residents, it's not going to be as big of an impact as it will be to Middlebury residents because of the ADM shift. As far as how much it impacts Middlebury town residents, my understanding is that generally a 1 mil increase is for $1 million. So they're looking at around a 2 mil increase. Josh, Joe, can you help me out with that one?
Yeah, I again, and not want to speak for the mill rate impact. I do believe it was about a mil, which in a sense would be about 2 mils increase on the Middlebury side. Southbury, I believe, was, again, can't speak for, I want to say maybe theirs was like 0.4 of a mil again. Like, don't quote me on that one. Yeah, guessing on that. Middlebury, I do believe, was around 2 mil when it was included us and wherever the town budget was. But again, that's an estimate on what we thought. And we did actually, the impact to them could be depending, obviously, size of your home. Again, $200 to $700 depending on size of house.
Does that answer your question, Sharon? Did we lose Sharon?
lost her video. I don't know if
Yeah.
her audio is still here. And the challenge is,
Okay, so actually just to confirm, because Robin, the finance director, corrected me. So one mil in the Middlebury side is equal to $1 million increase equals a mil. They're almost precisely correlated. So 2 million, that's roughly a $1.8 million increase in Middlebury. So it's about a $1.8 mil increase on that side. So thank you, Robin.
All right. Hopefully Sharon can get back on.
I'm going to unlock the meeting and try to let Sharon in. There were 2 other people waiting. I think they were trying to get public comment. So let's unlock the meeting and see if Sharon can come in. There's Sharon.
Sharon Attic, is that you? Yep. Yep, that's her. All right. All right.
So
any
I
other-
heard some of that, Sharon, but it is difficult for Joe or I to project out. I can do the math on a mill rate based on an average home. If your home is $287,000 or $300,000, like we could look at projected, but it is like, that's not our sandbox. So I get nervous playing. I don't want the town projecting our costs, but you can calculate mill rates. There's a formula. I do think that if your house is worth $300,000, it's about a $300 increase over the course of a year. But I'd want to dig into that and not speak off the cuff at a public meeting.
All right. I think Sharon is still trying to figure out how to get audio. So we'll circle back to her. Does any other board member have any discussion points about the budget? I see Shannon Cavallo, and then I see Richard Spirito. So Shannon.
So Shannon Cavallo here. First, I'd like to thank Superintendent Smith and his team for the countless hours in getting the budget to this point. I believe that as a board member, we have one of the most important responsibilities in our community. It's our role to help our community understand the importance of proper support for public education, whether that be in providing adequate finance, optimum facilities, staffing and resources, or better education programs for our children. Our decisions directly affect the lives of students and their families, the livelihoods of our teachers, and the economic well-being of our community. As we are working through this current global healthcare pandemic, I would like to thank my fellow board members for their strong commitment towards working towards the common goal of providing the best possible education for children in this community. Over the past week, between the public comments tonight and the 222 heartfelt emails from both Middlebury and Southbury residents, the community is supporting the budget as presented. It has come through loud and clear that our children's education is of the utmost importance in this region. While many of the stories brought tears to my eyes around families losing jobs or in the healthcare field and working tirelessly, which we thank from the bottom of our hearts, it has become apparent that the community is in full support of this budget, regardless of their personal struggles. All members of this community are feeling the full effects of what it takes to educate our students. Without a referendum, this decision is heavier than it's been in previous years, as the vote stops here with us. We have gone through multiple iterations of this budget to not only be fiscally responsible, but to ensure we have the children's best interests at the forefront. As a board member, a Middlebury resident, and a parent, I would ask that my fellow board members also support this budget and our community and move forward in unanimous support.
Thank you, Shannon. Richard, you're up.
Richard Spirito, Board of Education, Middlebury. First of all, Joe, you're probably right on the nose by 1.8 mil increase with the education budget. I don't know what the final town budget will be, but it's probably the total will be around 2 mils. So if you take your present taxes and multiply it by 2 more mils, you'll be able to figure out exactly what's going to cost you. That's the first thing. The second thing I was talking about was the my comments about the budget in general. You know, this is a global thing they have to look at. We need to look at the big picture. When taxpayers are unable to pay their taxes, that's going to be a problem. Because of peer pressure and social media, it takes great courage on our part, board members, especially with the ones who have students in the system, to come up and say we should stay with a status quo budget. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you, Josh, for all the work you did, and you too, Joe.
Thank you, Richard. All right, Steve, go ahead. Steve Siriani.
Sorry, I did not unmute myself. This is Steve Siriani. Couple things. So one, I understand that at least originally a lot of the budget increase was due to medical cost increases, and I know there are yearly variables that determine those increases. It's just big picture there, but and I know any change to insurance can't be done quickly. It impacts the towns as well with whom we share the plan. But I guess hopefully next year we're not sitting at a 1% increase, and I just maybe as a board action item or for finance maybe to just evaluate if that plan is still a good fit for us. If this was an anomaly, I'm sure we'll get more data as we go through time. So that's my one comment, I guess, for next year. And then the board's just going to have to bear with me for like 5 minutes, just because I really want to sort of read into the record, especially because we're not having a referendum, where and why I'm going to vote the way I vote. I take not having a referendum very seriously. I'm cognizant of the fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayer. I understand there was talk of a 0% budget or cutting our budget to soften the blow of large unemployment, perhaps that we might be living with for a while. But I just wanted to sort of just, and really bear with me, go into some history here. The last time we had an economic crisis, we had what I'm going to, back in 2008 starting or so, we had what I'm going to call 4 austerity budgets. In 2009, we did a 1.1, followed by a 2.5% the next year, and then 2 0 increases. Those 4 years of austerity came on the heels of large budget increases. In 2008, we did a 3.93. In 2007, so going backwards, it was 4.48. Then it was 4.74, 7.25% increase in 2005, and a 5.48 increase in 2004. That first austerity budget in 2009, that 1.1% was achieved in part by cutting 4 elementary tech teachers and 2 middle school health teachers. The plan was to have the classroom teachers integrate technology into their lessons. We as a board talked about the need for giving kids 21st century skills. We cut the teachers, and then it took years to follow through with the necessary teacher training, curriculum, and technology to make that happen. We basically made a cut and decided after the fact how to deal with the ramifications of that cut. Then we had 2010, where we did about a 2%. That was the first year of a new teacher's contract, and the teachers took a 0% pay raise. Increase. This was not due to skillful negotiations on the board's part, but because at the time of the contract renewal, the economy had been stalled for a while, and the environment that we were in made the 0 possible. My point is that the 0% raise wasn't a result of the shock to the system, but rather a result of the new economic normal that we had been living with for some time. 2011, we had our first 0% budget increase. There were, we did that with a 5.5 teacher cuts due to declining enrollment. We had 3 classified reductions, and we had $688,000 in savings to the budget due to the sale of bonds, retired debt savings, and funding from a jobs bill. In 2012, when our peer districts of Madison, Monroe, Simsbury, Region 5, Avon, New Milford, Newtown, Fairfield, Southington, Cheshire, Seymour, and Bethel had budget proposals that ranged from 1.31 to 4.79 Region 15 put forth a second 0% budget increase. And in his presentation to the board at that time, the superintendent had already identified a need to invest in technology and acknowledged the damage to the middle school health program that was done years before. But in that second zero budget in 2012, we chose not to address the needs before us. There's not even a mention of adding a Chromebook to inventory in that budget, because we still relied on the PTOs to purchase them as accessories to the classrooms, not as essential elements funded by the budget. We had savings from bond refinancing and shifting the medical from the PPO to the plan we have now. We actually had an increase in excess cost revenue, and we went from what would have been a 341 to a 0. And at a board meeting, discussing how they got to this 0% increase the second time, the superintendent and finance director stated that going forward, there were likely no more opportunities to save by restructuring debt or bonds or the medical plan. There were no more 0% increases in the teacher contract. They literally used the phrase, we have no more rabbits to pull out of our hat. They use that in the presentation. We got to that 0% a second time because we chose not to reinvest those savings back into the district. I do genuinely believe that the district suffered from those austerity budgets in terms of opportunity costs missed. I think it could be argued that curriculum development and capital projects were neglected. We kept the budgets low without planning how to deal with the consequences. What's different now compared to 10 years ago is that the district has a plan. We need to fund that plan, a plan that focuses on the growth of all students, the maintenance of technology and curriculum, professional development, capital, and positive school climate. The responsible thing to do is to fund the plan. In fact, unlike 10 years ago, I don't think now is the right time for a budget that's overly cautious, because there are so many variables we haven't accounted for. We don't know what the new normal is. What's different now also is that the 296 is not coming on the heels of budget increases in the 4 to 7% range like we saw in the 2000s. So for now, I'm in favor of sticking with the plan that the superintendent put forth. And a mere 6 months from now, when the admins and superintendent begin putting the 21-22 budget together, they can take a pulse on the economic and educational environments and alter the plan if they need to, and then we'll budget that plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sirianni. John Cookson.
I know it's a no-win situation, no matter which way we go here. You've got the negatives, you've got the positives, the whole thing. The one thing to remember here for Middlebury, unfortunately, the ADM shift came along, and that is a huge factor in focusing on what is going to happen to Middlebury. If there was a way of changing it, you definitely would feel a different impact on Middlebury and where we have to go. But I must tell you that I've looked at the ADM shift. I've watched this budget since way back in November and December. And I must say, I wish there was a way to change it, but I just do not see it anywhere along the line with all the increases that we have had to face based on the ADM shift, what we had to do with insurance and with the teachers, and the pressure also that Middlebury, with all of the emails that have come through based on what is happening at LMES, MMES. So my support will still be for the 296 budget. Thank you to Josh and Joe for all their work and everything that is going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cookson. Heather Dwyer, thank you.
Hi. I just also want to say thank you to all of the residents of Middlebury and Southbury who did email us over the last couple weeks and voice their concerns. And what I heard loud and clear is that a lot of our families are impacted by this health crisis. They're impacted by this economic crisis. And I think what I've also heard is this is also an educational crisis. We have parents who are working who are struggling, and we have parents who are not working who are struggling to provide their kids with an education while school is not in session. And I think we are going to be feeling the impacts of this through the next year. And I'm concerned about going into next year, the level of need that we are going to see from these students who will have been out of school for almost 6 months. In addition to the fact that we may go into school next year and have other social distancing criteria that are going to impact the education that we deliver. So voting on a budget now, I'm very cognizant of the fact that we have a lot of unknowns about what is coming down the pipeline. And so as much as I'm concerned about the long-term economic impact of this health crisis, I'm also concerned about the long-term educational impact of this health crisis, and I want to do everything that we can to prepare for that. So I am also in favor of the 296, and I think that's what we need to do to be responsible for our community and for all of our families who are struggling through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dwyer. Sharon Attic?
So my apologies. I was, this is Sharon Attic. I was booted off my computer previously, but I appreciate all the comments and questions and things that have come through. So thank you to my colleagues on the board. I also too want to thank everyone from the community for writing in. I think that there was absolutely overwhelming response in favor of the budget. I absolutely acknowledge the financial situation that we are in and will continue to be in, but I also think that the need to support our education system is twofold, not only for our children, but for the long-term health of our town. It is one of the leading draws to Southbury, and I'm assuming Middlebury. People move here for the school systems. We need to be continually to invest in our school system. So when we are out of this crisis currently, we have long-term sustainability. I am also concerned about the unknowns in 2021. I trust that the superintendent and the administration have done their due diligence to look at everything across the board. Clearly, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of transparency in how that budget and the additional offsets to actually decrease the potential budget has been done, coming down from 2.59 to 2.96. I really hope that that is enough to get our students where they need to be, having come off a 6-month break. But I am absolutely in favor of the 2.96 budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Attic. I think Heather Rogers, I saw your hand. Heather Rogers.
I just want to thank Josh, Joe, Carrie, and everyone for considering the impact of this shutdown on our classes next year. I have to say I have never gotten so many emails on an issue as I have over this vote. The outcome of a referendum for me, especially when it passes, signals to me that we did our job, that we listened to the administration, the taxpayers, and that we presented a fiscally responsible and educationally sound budget to the community. Not being able to have a referendum this year troubled me on many levels. I'm not a fan of losing rights, and the right to be heard and the right to vote are very important to me. And I think to all of us on this board. In not being allowed to have a referendum, we lost more than the right to vote. For me, I always felt that sense of community and coming together to support the budget, the gathering, the sign holding, even the Facebook posts with everybody smiling and their sticker and I was this number, kind of rallying the vote or letting their voices be heard. And I miss that. And I miss holding signs with the kids to remind people to vote and bringing them with me to witness how important it is that we exercise that right. That being said, if I had to guess, based on the sheer volume of supportive emails we've received, I think it would have passed in both towns. I just added this, but my husband and I are both self-employed. Both of our businesses are essentially shut down. We don't know what our finances will be, but I sit here confident that the education of our children and our region's children deserve to more than survive this pandemic, that our communities will rebound, and that we need to be ready and able to handle what this shutdown caused. We are elected to support education in a fiscally responsible way. As part of the process, I see that happening, and I have the courage to support this budget. So I am supporting Mr. Smith's proposal of a 2.96%, and I have faith that he and his team will do everything within their power to make it work, and they will continue to work hard and strive for excellence at a distance, and that when our students come back, they will come back to a region prepared to bridge any gaps and support them wherever they may be and in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Rogers. Peter and Brian, I don't know if you want to add anything or you're ready to go to a vote. No?
I'll just, Brian Watson. I just think I'm in total support of Mr. Smith's budget. I think that we don't know the lasting effects that this pandemic is going to have on our students. And it's our job to ensure that they have the right resources moving forward, educationally, social, emotionally. I'm glad to see that this budget is putting kids first, and I'm in full support of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. Mr. Vaccarelli, did you want to add anything to the discussion at this point, or have you said everything that you want to say?
I'm done.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else? Before we go to vote, I just wanted to add my opinion to the discussion as well. I agree with Mrs. Rogers. It is a heavy weight on the Board of Education that there's no referendum. When I first heard that governor's executive order, I was in disbelief because I did not anticipate that happening, and I certainly didn't want it. I agree that there's something nice when you know that there's community support for your budget, and it is a very heavy weight that the Board of Ed carries because there's no referendum. That being said, I do think that it's the responsibility of us to maintain a long-term vision for Region 15. And I really struggled, though, with the economic impact of this pandemic. I, too, my house has been personally impacted by the economic downturn. It is hard to have a future vision when you're worried about your next paycheck. And I really struggled with how do we do this budget in the midst of all this economic crisis. And pardon me for getting a little philosophical here, but I saw a post by Governor Ben Sass, and he was answering a question of why kids should do schoolwork when there's a dangerous pandemic. And he quoted C.S. Lewis in a speech that he gave to students who were entering World War II, and it was entitled Learning in Wartime. And he was asking whether it was appropriate to continue schoolwork while the world teetered on the brink of war. And I thought that really spoke to me about why it's still important to focus on our schoolwork and focus on the educational budget. And C.S. Lewis's point was that war was finite. And if society postponed the search for knowledge and beauty until they were secure, there would have been no search for knowledge and beauty at all. So what should we do, he asked. He's like, the only thing we can do was to continue pressing forward. We cannot act like we are unaffected and ignore the suffering, but we must keep keeping on. And that really spoke to me. back in February, when Mr. Smith proposed his budget, he was talking about how staffing is what makes what we are as a district. And that's true now more than ever. I've really seen teachers really reaching out to students, and during this time, those teachers are 77% of our operational costs. We've had a healthcare increase this year, which is sizable compared to prior years. It's hard to cut that. We're also increasing our pension contribution, and that's an issue which is important to both of our towns. Town officials had said to us that they want us to increase our pension contribution, and this budget starts that process. It doesn't even fully get us to where they want us to be, but we're starting the process. This budget has stronger internal controls and checks and balances, which is music to my ears. And that's done with human capital management and a financial system, which we really need. It expands educational opportunities for students. It provides necessary materials and supplies. It enhances curriculum and professional development. These are all really important things. And I think also what buttressed me were all the emails that we had, overwhelming. In my 7 years, I've never seen so many emails from people who were also in economic crisis, but were afraid of an educational crisis. And despite them losing jobs, they still wanted us to invest in education because they understood that the success of their town is related to infrastructure and to the school system. And I really thank everyone who reached out to the Board of Ed, pro and con, although there were only a few people against the budget, the rest were overwhelmingly in support. It really meant a lot to hear from you, and I read each and every one of those emails. So I think it's really important to drive Region 15 forward, but we have to balance that with the economic impact of the pandemic and the educational crisis that's going on right now with kids not being in school. I really appreciate the offsets to the budget that were recommended by Mr. Smith, which recognize the savings for schools not being physically open right now. But that also takes into consideration the impacts of being out of school and the risks involved and what we might be facing in the future, all the unknowns. So I absolutely support the 2.9% increase. And thank you very much, Mr. Smith, for all your recommendations, your rational approach, and balancing your view for Region 15 and offsetting economic impacts. So if anyone else has any budget discussion, happy to honor any other discussion points, or we can go ahead and call the vote. All right, so the motion on the table is a motion for the Board of Education to approve the 2020-2021 budget of $72,909,774, which represents a 2.96% increase. I'm going to do a roll call of the budget so that each person can say whether they vote aye, nay, or abstain. And just like I said, we're going to do a roll call just because it's a video conference and this is kind of an unusual time to be doing a budget. So I'll just go off my list here. Steve Sirianni.
Did you hear me? Steve Sirianni, I vote aye.
Thank you. Heather Rogers.
Heather Rogers, aye.
Heather Dwyer.
Heather Dwyer, aye.
Sharon Attic.
Sharon Attic, aye.
Brian Watson.
Brian Watson, aye.
John Cookson.
I vote aye.
Shannon Cavallo.
Shannon Cavallo, aye.
Richard Spirito.
Richard Spirito, no.
Peter Vaccarelli.
Peter Vaccarelli, no.
All right. Thank you, everyone. The motion passes. So the budget is approved. Thank you, everyone. Next, we have approval of minutes. May I have a motion to approve the Monday, March 23rd, 2020 special meeting minutes?
John Cookson, motion to approve the minutes of the meeting.
Do I have a second? Okay.
Steve Sirianni, second.
All right. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Oh. All right. May I have a motion to approve the minutes of Wednesday, March 25th, 2020 regular meeting?
Motion to approve the meeting of the March 25th.
Steve Sirianni, second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
May I have a motion to approve the Monday, April 6th, 2020 regular meeting?
Motion to approve the April 26th meeting.
Steve Sirianni, second.
Any changes to the minutes? No? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Announcement of future meetings. Monday next week, April 27th, 2020, we have a special meeting of the Board of Education. It is going to be a Board of Education workshop with CABE, which is the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education. We're going to be doing a workshop on areas of improvement for the Board of Ed and policies and best practices. That starts at 6:30 p.m. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn. John Cookson.
Second, Heather Rogers.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right.
Thank you.
It's, any opposed for a motion to adjourn? No, I think it passes. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
Night,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Good
night.
night, Richard. Good night, everyone.
This